Welcome to the Ayurveda for Women's Health podcast, where we simplify ancient Ayurvedic wisdom into practical guidance for everyday life. Between the overwhelming wellness trends, quick fixes, and conflicting health advice out there, we return to a science that has been around for thousands of years. I'm Rita, an Ayurvedic health counselor.
And I'm Brittni, an Ayurveda practitioner. In a world that disconnects us from our bodies, we are here to guide you back. Through body literacy, practical tools, and time-tested science, we will help you step boldly into a more empowered, aligned version of yourself. So let's dive in. This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not medical advice. Views expressed do not represent our employers.
It's that really Vata time that it's back and forth and right. Like outside in a t-shirt and then in our winter coat the next day. And that's always a little bit for the body to regulate and work with.
Yeah, I feel like that's what I've been talking with clients a lot recently is how to just transition and how to switch foods even when one day feels 30 degrees warmer and your body feels totally different. Like yesterday it was warm and I ended up having oatmeal for breakfast and I was like, wow, this feels really heavy today. It was too much because I could also hear the water running, just like everything was dripping around me. It was just like so kapha. And then I was having the oatmeal and I was like, maybe this was not the best choice for me today. It was like too heavy.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting how subtle like the changes can be, how they make me feel, even just from switching up my foods day to day.
Yeah, it's the very, very beginnings of the warm-up start. I'm done with oatmeal. It can be way too heavy for me. And exactly like you're describing, it'll just like hit me. I'm like, oop, nope, I need to switch this up and do a little bit of a lighter grain or something like that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, totally. And even the like mornings can still be cool. But then the day is hot. And I feel like that can be a tricky transition that I forget every year. And I'm like, oh yeah, I know what to do. I can adjust here. But it like takes that first time, like that first warm up of the season. I'm like, oh yeah, all right, back into this groove of switching up the winter into the spring. So
yeah. Well, that's a good segue for our conversation today, where today we're going to dive into digestion. So yeah, do you want to share any initial thoughts on that or maybe introduce what we're going to talk about a little bit more?
Yeah, I think, one word digestion, there's a lot wrapped up into that. And we're going to go into all of the details of digestion from the Ayurvedic lens and why it's so important. And I think that Rita and we both talk about how it's so overlooked in Western medicine and to think of it as relative to other imbalances that are going on in the body. And Ayurveda has this really lovely framework of understanding digestion relative to the rest of you, right? Because it is all connected and it is this ecosystem of how everything is working in sync together. And when it's not, the effects that we can see from that. So we begin by looking at digestion because we can gain so much information in understanding not just how to support the body to bring it back into balance, but understanding why it went out of balance in the first place. And I think that's a lot of what we'll talk about today. And we'll break it down of like why it is so foundational to our health, not just short term, but long term, right? How we look at it as a way of preventing even the development of disease and understanding how to view it through the Ayurvedic lens. So really bringing in the doshas and understanding what that actually means when we talk about that relative to digestion and everything that entails. So that's kind of the exciting pieces we're going to go into today. And then eventually we'll go into the imbalances of that as well in our part 2 of this conversation, because that can be really helpful in understanding. First, we're going to lay out the framework, and then we're going to talk about what you may actually be experiencing and like the symptoms that might be present, and then how to connect them to this overarching understanding of the foundations of digestion.
Yes. And I just wanted to circle back to what you said about it being an overlooked area, because I think that is incredibly true when we look at the Western medicine model and how digestion is managed or really not managed. And I think as a result of that, it's also just very overlooked in our culture. And I've had a lot of clients who I've worked with who came to me with different symptoms that digestion wasn't necessarily an initial complaint. Like they came to me for psoriasis or prediabetes issues or sleep, let's say. And when I asked about digestion initially, there wasn't a whole lot to speak of there. It wasn't a primary concern. And then, of course, as will unfold in this conversation today, we know that digestion is at the root and foundation for all of those symptoms. And so it's been really interesting to work with people and target digestion and then have them reflect back and be like, oh, I was bloated all the time. That was just my norm. Or, it just became my norm that I only had a bowel movement a couple times a week. I wasn't really thinking about that. That's been going on for years. And then when we start to kind of pull back these layers, we can create so much change in the body, physically, mentally, emotionally, when we balance digestion. And so I think that this episode, I'm hoping, can be supportive for people who are battling digestive challenges. I know that that's very, very common. And then also, I think even if it's something that people haven't really struggled with, I think there's still a lot to be gleaned from this.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to reiterate, I see that all the time as well with clients coming to me with kind of these other chief complaints or main concerns that they're not even thinking about it. And it's just so interesting to me, like how that can become just a part of our daily routine of something you deal with, but don't really address it, or we mask it, right? And I hear very often from clients that come to me, especially with constipation, and they've been told by their doctors, you'll just be taking Metamucil for the rest of your life. But they're not actually like addressing the issue. And so you just kind of get used to like this discomfort and this issue that is always constantly kind of sucking energy from you, whether we're consciously thinking about it or not. And so hopefully this conversation highlights how you can start maybe addressing some of those imbalances, because that's the other piece, is that when we do start making some simple tweaks or shifts, like we're not overhauling things usually, it's like making a few adjustments that we'll talk about today. I see the biggest changes in digestion for folks. And it makes sense because it's just not how we were taught to think about these things. We were taught to, I don't know what we were taught. I don't remember actually being taught about digestion. So I think that's kind of like the problem, is that we weren't actually learning about our bodies from a functional standpoint. And this is why we're having this conversation now.
Yeah, and I'm actually really glad that you mentioned the piece there about making small shifts, because I think sometimes, like I just started working with a client who very understandably was a little hesitant to start because of those words. She was like, I don't want to have to overhaul my whole life. Like, I'm kind of picky, and these are the foods that I like, and these are the foods that I don't like. And even just in changing some foundational pieces of how we're eating, or bringing some herbs in, or bringing some teas in, or when we're eating, and just some small shifts in food choices can make such a profound difference. And I think I always value the wisdom that different systems of medicine bring. Obviously, I'm very biased and I love Ayurveda, but there's so much from all these different systems. But when it comes to digestion, Ayurveda has that locked in.
Yeah.
Ayurveda looks at digestion as being at the foundation of all aspects of health and really understands how it works and how we can heal it.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Oh, I'm so excited. Well, do you want to kick us off with this conversation?
Yeah, definitely. So maybe to start, let's just define digestion and just kind of get everyone on the same page there. I think of digestion as really having these three main components. So we're talking about our ability to break down our food into small pieces, our ability to absorb nutrition from that food, and our ability to eliminate waste and have that regularity in our bowel movements. I think it's important to bring in those three pieces, because sometimes people will just think of digestion of like how they feel after a meal and not think about that back end bowel movement perspective. And particularly in Ayurvedic medicine, the definition of digestion goes far beyond the physical. So the term for digestion in Ayurveda is Agni, and it translates as our digestive fire. So it's inclusive of those things I just mentioned. It's our digestive strength to break down our food, absorb nutrition, eliminate waste, But it also includes our ability to process and break down and digest our experiences and our emotions, on our sensory experiences, our thoughts. So we'll get into that a little bit today as well. But essentially, you can think of digestion when we jump into the physical piece, it's really this disassembly line. Like we're disassembling, if that's a word, the food and breaking it down into small pieces. We're then absorbing the nutrition, and that nutrition is what then becomes the building blocks for our tissues. And that elimination of waste, it's really the foundation for detoxification.
Yeah, and within that, we see all the different elements at play, which is really cool. Like, I think that's a fascinating aspect of this process, of the digestive process, is that we have all of the five elements working with different purposes at different points in digestion. And we'll go into all those details. But I think it's this other way of understanding ourselves as nature, and we start to see these different elements supporting us through this process of taking in nutrition, taking in food, and applying it to our cellular makeup.
Yeah.
This huge transformation process with all of the elements helping us.
Yeah. 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 Do you want to kick us off and break that down?
Yeah. So if we begin in the upper part of the body, we'll say, right, like in the head area, because it's not just the mouth, right? Like food goes into the mouth, yes, but we also want to remember that the other sense organs are part of what stimulates the digestive juices, right? And that's what gets this process going. So we are taking into account the smell of the food, right? We're like connecting with that sensory experience. Even sometimes the feel of the food, if you're like feeling the texture, if you're touching it, you're seeing the food, right? There's this aesthetic that you're connecting with, and colors and freshness and vibrancy of the food. Maybe it's warm, you can see steam coming off of the food. So we're using all of our senses to tell the body, hey, food's coming. Get ready. Like, are you ready? Are you awake? Are there cooks in the kitchen, like ready to be here to chef up this food and bring it to the rest of the body? So I like to call that out because a lot of times when we miss that step, right, and we're drinking smoothies that we don't chew, or we're kind of missing that connection of this sensory experience, then we're not actually getting that full digestive stimulation from the enzymes. Like they're not actually fully awake yet. They're like, oh, maybe I'm not sure if is there something there? So it's like, we really want to be like, hey, we're coming. Like, here we go. And that's where we start to connect with the saliva, right? This next step. And that's the earth and water and that juiciness that you feel in your mouth. When you smell savory food, your mouth starts watering, right? Your saliva's kicking in. And that's where the breakdown process begins, is in the mouth. And so we're thinking about it from, okay, we're thinking about kapha, right? There's that kapha, earth and water, those elements in saliva are already activated in this area of the body. So kapha is this first stage of digestion. And within that earth and water, that saliva is mixing with the food and starting to break it down. And this is where the carbohydrates break down, is the first step, right? So simple sugars, things that are like quick to break down, saliva can do that, right? Like that's how strong that saliva is. Whereas like fats and proteins have to go through a couple more processes to be fully broken down. And we'll talk about that going forward. So it really is important to think about digestion, like you're saying, Rita. It's not just how I feel after I eat. It's really starting that process with engaging with the food, connecting with the food, and allowing yourself, your sensory experience to slow down, to have awareness of what you're eating and what's being put in your mouth.
Yeah. And I'm going to bring in a little bit of modern science to back up what you're saying in regards to how we think of the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is essentially a system in the brain that is doing threat detection at all times and alternating us between these two nervous system states. One of them, sympathetic, fight, flight, or freeze, parasympathetic, rest and digest. And so with what you were talking about in terms of the sensory organs, You talked about kind of the smoothie bypassing, but I'm even thinking of, I'm doing 20 things at once while I'm eating, like the working lunches and eating, my bar on the way to driving somewhere while I'm listening to a podcast, while I'm having a conversation, like the 20 things at once that so many of us are doing when we're eating. What's happening in the body and the nervous system is we're going to be in more of that sympathetic state. And so when that's the case, when we're in this kind of fight, flight, or freeze, because there's so much coming in through our sensory organs, we quite literally are going to see a decline in peristalsis, a decline in saliva production. So when we are multitasking when we eat, and I appreciate that there are circumstances where we can't maybe avoid that 100% of the time. But I think when that's the norm of how we're eating, we're really setting ourselves up for not being able to break down food well.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that because it's not just, okay, this one meal or this one time. If that's happening all the time and that's the regular way you're taking in food, then these other imbalances are going to start to come. You'll probably start noticing them pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Because the body maybe can handle that sometimes, but not every time. And that's where it really becomes a problem. And I will clarify on the smoothies, like, there's probably a lot we could talk about with the smoothies. I think our modern culture smoothie has like 25 ingredients in it.
Mm.
And that's part of the problem, is that we're just sucking down these like 25 complicated ingredients that have been pureed and blended into this like very easy to like shoot down form. And that's where we overload the liver and we overload the system in this other whole other way, that the body is just getting hit by a truck of all these different types of food groups and it doesn't know what to do with it. So so not all smoothies are unsupportive, but being mindful of the amount we're taking in at one time, I think maybe is the key point there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. I think just recognizing what the body has to do to break down food and the role that the sensory organs play and the role of chewing too, because the way the food is when it hits our stomach is the way it is when it leaves our mouth. And so if we're not chewing adequately, then we're also setting our stomach up to have a much harder time to break down the food.
Yeah, do you want to bring us into the next phase, so we kind of go through the mouth, through the esophagus, and now we're in the stomach area. And maybe just to add that initial like 1.5 to 2 hours is that first process of time. And that can depend on constitution or metabolism or like how fast your body is transforming it. That can vary per person. But on average, usually like 1.5 to 2 hours is kind of that first stage of digestion.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we're kind of following the food, and like you said, we're now in the lower part of the stomach. And so now we start what we think of in Ayurveda as the Pitta phase of digestion. And so Pitta is the elements of fire and water. And so it makes sense because this is the phase where we're really seeing this increase of digestive juices like the hydrochloric acid and the pancreatic juices and the bile and all of these that are really helping to break down the food that much further, which starts, in the upper parts of the stomach, but continue in the lower parts of the stomach as we go into the small intestines. And so, in this phase, we move into a phase of absorption where we've broken down the food into these really small particles. And in this phase, we start to digest our fats and our proteins a bit further.
Yeah, and Pitta is that more transformative energy, and we need that fire and that acidity to make that food into that really usable form. And this is where, like, if that's not happening at this phase, right? I guess we'll talk about it more in the later section, but when it's not broken down is where we start to like see food particles come out the other end, right? Like it's okay, if we're seeing that in our bowel movements, then we can say, okay, well, what part of this breakdown process is not happening and why? And so that gives us a lot of information, knowing this whole system and what's happening at each part.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, for example, if you're not having any digestive issues right after you eat, but then it really hits you a couple hours later, we can look a little bit more, okay, what's going on in the small intestines? What's going on with your pitta? But yeah,
Hmm.
we'll dive into that. But I
Hmm.
think it's good to mention now because almost like put a plug in of what phase of the digestive tract it seems to perhaps be problematic for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd say I would just add that for this part of digestion, this like phase two, it's not just the stomach and the small intestines, right? Like the liver is at play, right? The liver and the pancreas and making sure there's enough bile, like the gallbladder is squirting out the bile. So all of those organs and glands have to be working together as well to support digestion. So it's not isolated, right? Body and what they're doing. So it's this, yeah, the whole ecosystem of the organ functions.
Yes. Yes. I like how you called it an ecosystem. I love thinking of the body that way. It is.
Yeah,
That's exactly what's happening. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Do you want to continue us into the large intestine?
So in the large intestine, also known as the colon, right? So this is where we enter the Vata stage. And this is where there's a couple functions that happen, right? We're absorbing minerals into the rest of the body, right? So whatever's left from that breakdown process ends up in the large intestine. And then from that waste, the body is getting the rest of the water and the minerals out. And that's like its last grab of anything that it needs before it's like, okay, now I'm completely done with this and we can move it out of the body. And that becomes really important because, like, we could look at if there's a lot of dryness in the body, that might be where someone's having that constipation is getting stuck in that large intestine area, right? And that's more of vata, right? Like excess dryness or wind in this very large container, this very large space. And so we can think about if those qualities are present and it's happening in the Vata stage of digestion, well, we want to address Vata with the imbalance there.
Yeah. Like if there's too much dryness there, then we see the constipation. If there's too much heat and
Hmm.
inflammation, we can see stool going right through you.
Yeah, and I think it's just fascinating to think about the connection between all three of them, like
Mm.
the Kapha, Pitta, and the Vata, and that they all have this progression. And we also know that we see this foundational system in other ways, right? Like our stages of life. We go from the Kapha stage to the Pitta stage to the Vata stage. Whereas when we start out young, we're very juicy. There's a lot of earth and water. We're growing. And then we go through this pitta stage of life. It's our bleeding years. It's our, establishing ourselves. It's our transformative years. And then we move into vata and our bodies become drier. We lose our hormones. And so, anyways, not to go into like the depth of that, but I think it is fascinating. We see this in other areas through this Ayurvedic medicine lens, not just with digestion, but with how nature is working in a very synchronous way.
Yeah, I love that you called that out because I think that same pattern that you mentioned is the phases of life. It's also the cycle throughout the year, like
Mm.
Kapha's springtime, and then we go into Pitta summer, and then we go into Vata fall into
Yeah.
winter. So we see that in the cycles of nature. We also see that same cyclical pattern in our menstrual cycle. So I think it's another way that we can feel connected to nature is recognizing the same patterns and the same cycles that are happening in the microcosm, the macrocosm. Yeah,
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. It's really beautiful.
it is beautiful. And, to bring it back to that
Mhm.
cycle that we're seeing, that Kapha, Pitta, Vata cycle that's happening, again, just to call out why it's important for that to happen and be able to break down our food that way is one, our nutrition, what gets absorbed during that absorption phase is then going to get delivered to our tissues. It's going to get circulated in the body and quite literally become the building blocks for our tissues. So you'll hear people say, like, oh, you are what you eat. Well, you are what you can digest. Eating something doesn't necessarily mean that you can break it down and absorb the nutrition. So one big important piece is that that's becoming your tissues. And I think the other big piece of that is when that's not happening smoothly, when there's a breakdown really at any of those levels, we can experience what we call in Ayurveda as ama. And ama essentially, you can translated a few different ways. You can think of it as undigested food. You can think of it as toxins. You can think of it as metabolic waste. But essentially, if we're not properly breaking down our food, then we're going to get this coating throughout our GI tract, and that can get circulated in the body as well. And that is one of the big drivers that then creates imbalance. And, depending on which tissues, it may show up as things like psoriasis or things like diabetes, blood sugar issues. And that's bringing that back to the initial conversation as a way to connect digestion to other things that are happening.
Yeah, and I like to think about it in terms of the elements too. Like if we have, an excess of fire in our digestive system, and then that is being circulated through your blood, right? And then that's what's then going out to all of your tissues, and you have overheated cells that are being developed. That is what can lead to, heat type imbalances, like, even skin issues like you're talking about is where we can start to see some of that show up first. And if it is, if it's the, another element like, excess wind, we're going to see more dryness being circulated through the tissues, right? If the blood is deficient, that's what's going to the rest of the tissues. So that's where digestion really is so important it's not isolated from what else is going on in the body. It's very much connected. And usually if by addressing digestion first, we start to see this trickle effect of imbalances starting to heal through supporting the nutrition that you're receiving.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I know we're going to get into more of the imbalance pieces in our next episode, so I don't want to go too far down that route. I would like to talk a little bit about the mental emotional aspects of digestion, but is there anything else you want to say on the physical piece?
No, I think that I like what we covered. I think that feels complete.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, where do you want to start with the emotional mental piece? There's so much to say on that topic. What comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I think I would start with, maybe I'll give an example first.
Sounds great.
Because growing up, I struggled with constipation for years, and I didn't have these tools and understanding it until much later in life. But I would also feel very tired a lot, right? And I think that, when you're feeling tired, it affects how you show up and how you feel emotionally and how you connect with people. And a few years ago, actually, John, my husband and I were skiing together, ski touring. We might edit this out because I might be embarrassed after sharing this, but I'll share it anyway. We were skiing and it was 10 in the morning. I didn't really have a reason to be tired. And I was so tired. I was like, I don't know, maybe we should go home. Maybe we should be out here. And then I was like, oh, you know what? I think I have to go to the bathroom. And then I went off into the woods and had a bowel movement, came back, and I was like, I'm ready to go. Let's keep going. I feel great. And it just really highlighted it for me. And it was hilarious that he was with me. I think maybe that helped me connect the dots too, because we talked about it and kind of laughed about it. And now we know if I'm tired, it's Brittni, do you have to go to the bathroom? Let's check in first and see, do you just have to have a bowel movement? So I share that because I think we're not separate from what we're feeling in our body emotionally and, mentally. And I think that really highlighted that for me in that experience. Kind of an embarrassing story, but also I'm sure relevant for more people.
100%. Yes.
So, yeah, what's going on the inside, especially with digestion, is impacting how we're able to show up in the world and how we're having conversations and how we're feeling about ourselves, right? Because if I just went through the whole day just kind of feeling bad and not really understanding, if maybe I was just ignoring that urge to go, then I'm going to show up a lot differently and feel differently and kind of feel this anxiousness buzzing in the background where my body was actually giving me the signal you need to go take care of this, go to the bathroom. So yeah, it's very connected. And I see this often even with clients in different ways. And I know we'll talk about more of the imbalances that we see, but very often there's a connection. If I ask a client to describe the qualities of what they're experiencing in their bowel movements, right? Say that their bowel movements are really loose and hot and very Pitta type. And then I also see that their emotional tendencies are very critical or very judgmental. And there's this sharpness to it, there's this heat to it. And so I think that we can learn a lot by looking at the body and what the body's doing and looking at it next to how we feel emotionally. And that, eventually brings us into how to balance that. But they're almost like stemming off of each other too. Like, well, which one came first? So I think that's where we can like get curious in the questioning. What began first and how did it begin and what was going on in your life when it began and when we're looking at the timeline. So
Yeah. I think it's such an interesting thing, that pattern of what we see in our digestion and the pattern we see in our mind. Because I've also seen a pattern with all or nothing tendencies and people who can be really all or nothing mentally. And then the bowel movements, they'll see this like fluctuating constipation versus diarrhea. Or I think in situations with constipation, there can just be this excessive upward motion that's happening. And if we're thinking about having a lot of sensory inputs throughout our day, a lot of cognitive processes throughout the day, then I think it can be pulling that energy upwards. And if we think about that digestive tract process we described going downwards, we're like fighting against that. And so it's interesting to look at the body from that lens.
Yeah, it's so intelligent, right?
Yes.
Like whatever the body's doing, like we need to pay attention because it's telling us something.
Yes.
And it's not separate from how we feel. And I've even seen too, with a lot of perfectionism, I've seen constipation. Which I always associate perfectionism as more of a Pitta type. And I would almost expect to see looser bowels or like more often bowel movements. But I see constipation. And I think that perfection piece of it is this like tightening in the body and this like rigidity and stiffness and stuckness. I've seen it with a few different clients. Things need to be a certain way, or I need to complete this in a certain time frame. Just having more of that Pitta mind, it creates this rigidity and tightness in the body that can show up as drying itself out. That heat is kind of starting to create dryness as opposed to wetness, or like not wetness, like an oily.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see it's not always that like Vata at the root of it sometimes.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, it makes sense when you think of it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have any funny stories? Not to put you on the spot, but
Share more poop stories. I mean, it's what we talk about in Ayurveda, right? Yeah. I mean, let me think about that for a second.
it's fine if you don't.
Yeah, I don't know that I can think of any on the top of my head.
That's fine.
I guess like sometimes I think when I get up, I almost said on stage. I'm not on stage. I'm in my office. But when I have these conversations, I always just want to call out and acknowledge that we can understand the science of digestion, and then putting it into practice can be a different process entirely.
Yeah. People listening to this might think that we've never experienced these things, and that is like not the case at all, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Like it is still, I have to pay attention. And if I'm not paying attention, just like we were saying at the beginning, if I continue to eat oatmeal through Kapha season and overload my digestion at the wrong time with a heaviness at this season where my body actually needs more lightness, then that's going to create imbalance in my digestive tract.
Yeah. Well, and everything's in flux. And I think that's perhaps not any more true than when we're talking about digestion and how we think of it as this fire. In Ayurvedic medicine, fire is unstable and it's constantly changing in size, and it's, growing when it comes time to eat. And then we're using the fire to digest our food. And then we want to see it kind of grow back up. But when we travel, when we're stressed, it's constantly changing. It's constantly in flux. And it's, when we're working with clients, it's never the goal of we fix digestion and then it's just great for the rest of your life. It's something to be in relationship with, because it's really this first sign from the body in many cases that something's off. And when we listen to that, we can avoid some further deeper imbalance issues. And so I think a big part of what we're doing in this world and in our practices, and hopefully with this podcast, is helping people to connect deeper with those symptoms in the body and not ignore and bypass them. But then also, I think on the other end of this, I think we can become really hyper aware and think that we're doing something wrong, or think that, I can't figure this out like the rest of those Ayurvedic specialists. And it's like, well, just a reminder that we're all human. We're all just trying to figure it out.
Absolutely. And we're also learning how to course correct, right? And they're like, oh, okay, that didn't work that great last time. So now I know how to like slightly adjust or tweak for this next time or in this different season. And the same, that nature is changing all the time, constantly. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We are also in that same movement pattern, right? And so it's just a matter of paying attention to it. We all have an abundance of tools to work with ourselves and our body if we use nature as our guide.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe let's close this out by giving some tools and some practical guidance that I think all can benefit from. And I think in the next episode, we'll get into more specifics with imbalances, but maybe today we can just share some tips that are really supportive for all constitutions and all types of digestive issues.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. Well, the first one that comes up for me, I mean, chewing, I think, is always at the top of my list, but I think we talked about that one earlier. I do think that is something, even if that was the one takeaway from this podcast, is to spend a little bit more time chewing your food. I often say try to get it to applesauce consistency. I think that can go a long way. But one that I really wanted to talk about was meal spacing, because I think this is so big and can be such a game changer for so many people. If you think about that earlier discussion that we had and how food is going along this path in the GI tract, what we essentially want to happen is we want to allow that food to move through the stomach fully, and really move into that small intestines and a little further down into the small intestines even before we have our next meal. And if we're in a pattern of grazing and just snacking throughout the day, what can happen is, say I ate lunch, right? And it's like an hour and a half after I've eaten lunch. So the food's at the very bottom of my stomach, let's say. And then I go and I have another snack and I'm not having the hunger. I'm just, feeling like snacking because snacking's fun and yummy. And what can happen is the body then has to allocate energy up towards the upper part of the stomach and release some juices and things to work with that snack, which then allocates energy away from that lower part of the GI tract. And so when we talk about that that undigested food, I think that's what I've found in my practice as one of the biggest culprits is grazing throughout the day as compared to, spacing our meals. And I always want to bring in a caveat that's not me in any way, shape, or form saying to suppress hunger. I think some of us have stronger appetites and need to eat more frequently than others. And I always bring it back to hunger with that versus, looking at the clock and trying to have your 3.5 hours or whatever it may be, but it's really more about hunger. But we want to tune into that hunger and tune into when the GI tract is telling us that it's ready for more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a really big one. And I see clients make that simple adjustment. First, starting with tuning into those hunger cues, giving themselves space between meals, and also eating enough at that meal to be satiated. Because I've also found that someone will eat and it's just not enough. And then an hour later, they're hungry and they're noticing that they're always hungry.
Yes.
So, yeah. And I see clients make the couple adjustments a week later, they're like, wow, all my bowel movements have been regular.
Yeah, that's such a big one.
And they didn't even change what they're eating or anything else, but the timing of meals.
Yeah.
And I had a client, an ultra runner, and every training run that she would go on for 10 years, it could be a mile, it could be 10 miles. She would always have these very urgent bowel movements, no matter when she was running. We adjusted some of the meal timing because, again, she was kind of snacking, but not really eating a meal, eating enough at mealtime and then was just snacking afterwards. And then she started eating breakfast and lunch and dinner at consistent times. No more urgent bowels on runs. Mm-hmm. And she even ran a 100-mile race. Wow. No bowel issues. And this was 6 weeks after us working together.
Yeah.
This was and she struggled with that for 10 years. So yeah, it really can be that simple sometimes. So just not underestimating the power of tuning into the body in that way. Am I even hungry for this? Or am I still hungry? Did I eat enough? That quantity, that amount, that timing is going to look different for each person.
Yeah, I could share so many stories where spacing alone, it's one of the very first things I start with, and it's always so profound. I've seen that make such a huge difference, specifically with people who have had pretty profound digestive imbalances too, like Crohn's disease and IBS. Meal spacing can just make such a difference. And it's interesting, I'll bring a little modern science in as well. There is a concept that's called the migrating motor complex. And I tend to explain this as our inner janitorial service. So essentially, after we have finished a meal, we end up having this series of waves, these peristaltic waves throughout our GI tract, which essentially is the GI tract moving along any undigested particles, moving along any waste products. Yeah. If
anyone's like that. If anyone's watching, it's like wiggling your hands like you're doing the worm dance on the floor.
Yes.
But going down.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. I feel like that's it. We should make sure we clip both of us doing this like octopus hands. So yeah, I think what is so important there, that migrating motor complex, that janitorial wave that's happening in the body, it doesn't happen when we're snacking. We need to have a certain amount of space and time between meals to allow that to happen. So I think that that's a great example of where modern science can really reinforce what Ayurvedic medicine's been saying for thousands of years. But for people who need the science, I just wanted to include that piece as well.
Yeah. And I, bringing it back to the elements, right? Just like you said, for that process to happen, we need space.
Yes.
Right. And that is one of the foundational elements that we work with through Ayurveda. So I call that out because so often I find clients that are moving at a fire pace. The elements are not balanced within how they're moving throughout their day. And part of that, just highlighting why we need space. We don't just need fire and wind to move us forward, right? We need space to allow other things to happen in the body. And we're just up against a culture that doesn't really support that. And so finding those little ways like to create that space, even like you're saying, having those, having that space between meals is one way to embody the element of space in your life and in your day. It doesn't have to be this whole big thing.
Yeah. And I think also, I just want to acknowledge, because I know that emotional eating is a big thing for so many people. And it's definitely something that I really, really struggled with for most of my life personally. And it's something I think that it's interesting. I'll talk often with clients when there is that emotional eating happening, like that snacking throughout the day or just finding yourself in the kitchen in that way. It's really interesting, right? Sometimes those cravings can be nutrient depletion and we're lacking something in the body. Sometimes I think it can be we're feeling this scatteredness and we're almost putting this food in to try to make our bodies heavy and ground us in a way. I think it can be sometimes like even procrastination, like we're finding ourselves going and snacking and things to avoid other things. So I just, wanted to acknowledge that I think it's really human and really, really, really common if you are someone who's grazing throughout the day and not having that space between your meals. I guess what I want to say about that is I think sometimes people will listen to this and be like, I need more discipline, right? Like I need more discipline to space between my meals and to not snack and not graze. And I think you and I would look at that more and be like, well, let's be curious about that. Why do we think that's happening? What's really underlying there? And I just don't really believe don't get me wrong, discipline plays a role in health. I think it always will. But at the end of the day, I think so often we will think about needing to have more discipline in certain aspects of our life, when in reality, it's like, well, where do you need support?
Yeah, it's kind of approaching it from like a flow perspective. It's more just like flowing with your body, right? And moving with it and kind of dancing with like, oh, that's curious. That's interesting. Well, why is that? As opposed to like shaming ourselves. Why don't I do it this way? And why haven't I done it this way? And I wish I knew better. And I just see that so often with clients. And I think that reframe in the approach can be really supportive in allowing there to be a softer guidance for trying something new, as opposed to, I need to just start doing these like 3 meals a day and that's it. And then I'll be good.
Yeah.
Like that's also not what I'm recommending, right?
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
that might
Yeah.
not be what you need. And I think tuning into the individuality of it is the most like supportive, curious step forward.
Yeah, and I think that leads me to another foundational tip when it comes to digestion. I guess we've already talked about this, but just to really flow with what's going on in your digestion and in your life. And so when life gets complicated or when you start to notice symptoms, bringing in some easier to digest meals. I think that's a really big piece. I know in Ayurveda, there's a lot of talk about khichdi, which is this very easy to digest mung bean and rice and veggie soupy kind of meal that actually can be quite tasty if you make it right.
Mm.
And that's just one example. It doesn't have to be khichdi, but I think just in general, having tools that you can bring in and specifically recipes that you can bring in that are simpler and easier for your body to break down, either when mentally, emotionally life is getting crazy or when you start to notice that your digestion is off.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's bringing it back to that energy perspective where if there's stress or there's something else going on or there's a lot of busyness or chaos and like a lot of movement happening, the body's trying to process all of that. And it's like working really hard, putting a lot of energy towards that because it's prioritizing that survival and like, addressing the stress as opposed to digesting. And that's where it's going to prioritize. So let it do that, right? And
Yeah.
like set it up for success in that way where it's like, okay, I am feeling very stressed at work right now. I'm going to not go out for dinner every night. I'm going to have some home cooked soup and, let my digestion have a break at the end of the day instead of eating a greasy pizza or something. So there's just options that we can choose in that moment, say, well, what is supportive right now? Not is it good or bad for you, but what's supportive for my digestion when I'm experiencing stress?
Yeah. Yeah, and not just being in the habit of like, well, I eat the same thing every day because this is what I eat for lunch, this is what I eat for dinner, but really making some subtle shifts there.
Mm-hmm. If you're like a jack of all trades, you're kind of doing a lot of things, but maybe not doing any of them well.
Mm.
And so, if our body is doing that, we're processing stress, we're eating this heavy meal, we're doing all these different things, but none of them are really getting done in the way that they need to. So, I like to think about it that way in terms of digestion, where it's like, let digestion do what it needs to do, and then move on to the next thing, and then the next thing, as opposed to kind of fitting it all in at once. Because that's not how the body likes to use energy.
Yes. Well, I feel like we talked about some other tips as we went through. Are there any other tips that come to mind that you want to make sure we speak on here?
No, I think that's a good place to start. I think that keeping it to like simple, slow, and consistent is the main focus. I would usually start with people.
Consistent in terms of, do you mean like meal times more than necessarily consistent foods, right?
Yeah, consistent in like timing, right? So
Yeah.
instead of saying like, oh, well, this day I ate breakfast at 7:30 and then tomorrow I'll eat at 10. The body also does really well with rhythm, which we know that if we look at like our circadian rhythm, right? And how it moves with the sunlight and the moonlight. So having that consistency based on your hunger can be a good place to start. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, that might be a good place to wrap up for
Yeah.
this episode, unless there's
Yeah.
any final thoughts that you have.
No, I think this was a really good place to start with digestion. There's obviously so much more we can talk about, but I think that this is a good place to, some tidbits that people can start trying or making some tweaks and let us know what you try and what you do, right? Like join the Patreon chat and let us know. It helps all of us to know what people are going through and what people are experiencing. And so if you have some interesting stories of trying out different things, like share it with the community because all of us are in this together, learning how to be humans in this ever evolving world. So yeah, please share your experiences and what you tried, what you didn't like, what worked for you. It'd be curious to hear what folks gravitate towards or what stuck out to them.
Yes, I would love to hear that. I'd love to hear from people in our Patreon, like you said. And I'll also just do a plug for our wellness library, which is a $5 a month subscription where you get on-demand videos, kitchen tutorials, recipes, herbal formulations. There's all kinds of different videos and practices in there, but there's a whole lot on digestion. So if this was planting some seeds and sparking some fire for you, that might be a really great place to go next in learning some more information of this ancient wisdom practice of Ayurveda that really understands digestion quite well.
Yeah, there's some great teachings in there. There's also like great teas and recipes to try to support it. Like I know the CCF is in there and your Takra
Oh, yeah.
videos. So yeah, there's some really fun recipes you can start trying.
Yeah. And maybe just one last plug too, as we're growing this podcast and this community. If this was an episode that you found helpful, it would really help us if you spread it around, share it with your friends, subscribe on whatever podcast you subscribe to. It really does make a difference and help us to grow this community and spread this knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Rita, for sharing all of your knowledge. And I can't wait for our next conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Brittni. It's always fun.
If you enjoyed today's episode, it would mean the world to us and help support our work if you'd like, share, leave a review, as well as subscribe to our podcast on whichever platform you use. If you're looking for more connection or would like to support this podcast, we'd love to have you join our Patreon for $5 a month. Here you'll get bonus episodes and access to our community chat Q&A.
And don't forget to check out our wellness library, which is filled with self-guided classes, kitchen tutorials, herbal recipes, and more Ayurvedic practices, all for just $5 a month. Thanks so much for being here with us. Until next time, be well.